Today is March 4th, and for our transaction excellence, today I'm going to talk about Form 22B, which we refer to as the home sale contingency. The title of the form is technically the buyer's property contingency. This form has quite a bit to it, so part of the reason for doing this is to make sure that when we use forms like this, that we're using them in the correct way. So there are two forms that are very, very similar when a buyer has a home under the contract and a buyer has to put a home under contract in order to sell another, or in order to purchase another property. So I want to make sure going into this discussion that we're not confusing the two forms. So the 22Q is the form that the buyer would use if they already have a home that's under contract, but want to purchase something else. And in using a 22Q, their offer cannot be bumped out of the way of their buying position. The 22B, which we're talking about today, is the situation where a buyer has to sell a property in order to purchase the new property. The buyer has not yet listed their home, or maybe they just did. The buyer has a home, maybe they have a home listed, but they have not reached mutual acceptance. And anytime you have a 22B and your contingent status, that buyer may be bumped if another offer comes through until that contingency is either waived or satisfied. So talking about 22B, this home sale contingency is only that. It is only a contingency for the home sale itself. All other contingencies can exist outside of this one, and in addition to the 22B. So if you have other protections that you want, you should be making sure to include those specific contingencies as well. In other words, this contingency is only able to protect the buyer if their property they are selling fails to close. Another thing is a seller can bump any offer with any offer they choose. Anything that's marked contingent can be bumped. The seller can choose what offer can bump that contingent offer. Any inaction with this contingency will result in an automatic termination of the contract unless you reinstate. The financial protection for your buyers to have will be protected by the financing contingency. So if you only put in a 22B, you are not protecting a buyer should their financing not go through. And then no matter how many stacked contingencies there are, this could be buyer upon buyer upon buyer needing to sell for that first buyer to satisfy the contingency. The timeline for the first buyer is the ultimate timeline for the mutual acceptance to occur with all the others underneath them. So make sure you're checking on your timelines and you're giving yourself realistic ones that can match up. All right, let's talk about the form itself and how to fill it out. So this form is the 22B. I just took off the first 4 lines where it has reference to the transaction you're in. The first paragraph is where you're going to put the property that needs to be sold in order to purchase the new property. The on or before is the contingency expiration. So that's the amount of time that buyer has to get this property that they've listed here in paragraph 1, line 6, under contract. Now, there are 2 important things that need to happen with this. Number 1, this is the most important rule of this entire form, and if violated, could actually put your client in a very, very bad situation. Number 1, the buyer has to list their property. Now, this is a negotiable time frame, and it defaults to 5 days. But within the days that are decided on line 11, your buyer has to put their property on the market for sale. If the buyer fails to do that, if they don't put it active on the market, put it for sale, then they have broken the first rule right here. And the consequence for that rule is that all of the contingencies in the entire contract are waived and the buyer has to close within 30 days. Now, if this doesn't happen, if the buyer can't close within those 30 days, the earnest money is given to the seller. So then the next thing that can happen is the buyer can actually sell the property. If the buyer is going through this whole contingency before the expiration, they have the opportunity to either waive or satisfy this contingency, depending on how the rest of this contract looks. So the definition of selling this property right now is going to be considered under contract. There are different ways that we can say that. We can say sell, selling, sold, but that all just means that an enforceable contract has been put together and that buyer can now move forward with the sale as a closing date has been established. So when we do things like this, we are going to give notice on forms that I'll talk about later. Now, there are certain sales that a 22B buyer is going to have to get permission to accept. And our two rules for that are, one, if a buyer accepts a sale that is also contingent on either another 22B or a 22Q, which is the pending sale, they need permission of that seller. They also need permission if they're going to close less than 30 days or more than 45 days. And these reasons are every closing date that that buyer accepts directly affects the seller. Automatically, that sale is going to close 3 days after the buyer's sale. So a seller can go into this kind of pre-deciding that between 30 and 45 days are acceptable and that nothing is going to necessarily have to be extended. Anything beyond those two things, though, does require the consent of the seller, and there are specific forms we need to get that consent from. Luckily, this form, because there are so many forms attached to this with giving consent and asking for consent and giving notices, that each one of these forms has been listed in the lines when that response is needed. If an offer is accepted that violates one of these things, you as the, if you're the person that ends up accepting that for that buyer is now in jeopardy of that seller terminating the contract because they lacked that consent before it was accepted. So what are the consequences exactly on this? For the following 3 days after they give notice that they've accepted this offer, that seller could, if they choose, terminate that contract, keep that buyer's earnest money, or just let it be. Now, and hopefully in most cases, it will be so close that a seller will just let it be. After those 3 days are given, this contract clause right here is treated as if it never happened. So if you make it past those 3 days, then it's an implied consent that the seller is fine with what you've accepted and everything is going to close according to the timeline in that other offer. You do have a choice in the 22B when the buyer makes loan application. So as a seller, you may want to consider the fact that this entire contingency can take weeks. I mean, it defaults to 45 days. So that huge timeline that you have for that buyer to get their home under contract could technically start a timeline very, very far down the road. Now, with every single timeline of this form, it does start at the date this offer is accepted, not the date that this offer finds a buyer. The only exception to that is making loan application, and that's because it can be negotiated on when that application is made. If you're looking at this right here, buyers and sellers alike, you're probably going to want to know for sure right off the bat if that buyer is going to be qualified to purchase this home. So just knowing that these are choices here are something that you should keep in mind when you're reviewing this offer that's being sent to you, or if you're filling it out. And remember, if you're making application, that does mean it needs to be sent to a lender with a loan commitment. Just like on the 22A, all of those things need to be given to the lender. And if you are making a loan application, this does not protect you like the 22A. If you have a need for the financing contingency, you're going to also want to put in a 22A. All right, the buyer who has put in this offer is also going to make every effort possible to sell their home. they're going to keep it on the market. So paragraph 4 says they are going to keep it on the market and keep making these attempts to sell the home. And as soon as this offer is accepted, we just move into the contingent status. Now, as long as this is contingent, another buyer can come in and potentially bump this first buyer out of the way. So contingent 22B buyers need to be as diligent as possible to try to satisfy this contingency and move forward so they can't be bumped out of the way. Keep in mind your timelines too. This gives you the opportunity to negotiate how much time is given back and forth with your bump. And it defaults to 5 days, which may not seem like a lot, but that's a week. That means if another offer comes through that's better than this contingent offer or that could bump it out of the way, after giving notice, the buyer has 5 days. They have a whole week to try to get their home under contract and not let that bumped buyer take their place. So you might want to consider this timeline and how that might realistically look for your transaction. This also this also, I gotta scroll down a tiny bit here. Once you give the bump notice, this form has given us some really great direction now as of, the last revision of this form on which ones to actually use for the bump notice and the bump reply. All right, contingencies being satisfied. I'm going to go into all the different ways a contingency can either be satisfied or waived and exactly what that means. But what I wanted to point out here, because this is still part of the 22B, is when an offer comes in, the notice to the seller that you've received an offer and accepted it has to be given to that seller within 2 days of receiving it. Okay. You're going to go ahead and attach it to the notice that you've done this, but also make sure that you've attached a complete copy of the purchase and sale agreement. Anytime you're going to give notice to a seller of satisfying a contingency, you need to attach the entire offer. And how do you know when it's satisfied versus when you're waiving it? We'll get there in a second. But know that when you do accept it, you're going to be accepting it between 30 and 45 days without a contingency in place unless you have permission. And you may not do any extension of the closing date or even expedite the closing date. So basically, you can't change anything without seller's permission once you've already accepted this. Now, there are consequences, of course, for everything. Now, this entire contingency is here to give the buyer a really good fighting chance of selling their home, and they're going to make a good faith effort to do this. The only time that you have penalties on this contingency are basically when the buyer is doing things that are not with the consent of the seller. So during the course of this entire contingency, which is laid out in their timeline from paragraph 1, the buyer can, if the sale fails to close, then it does protect the buyer. The buyer can go through as many potential acceptances and contract cancellations within that contingency timeline, but they have till the very end of that timeline to actually get it under contract to move forward and still be protected. So if the buyer's property does fail to close by the end of the entire timeline of this entire contingency, then if it's no fault of the buyer, the contingency can be reinstated. If the agreement terminates, like I said, if the buyer accepts an offer and the agreement terminates, if it's within the contingency timeline, then the buyer can put it back on the market. If the sale for the buyer's property fails to close after the expiration of the contingency, then, unless that buyer waived the contingency, I'm not talking satisfied, this would have been a satisfaction, but if they waived the contingency, that would be the only exception, that they would not get their earnest money back. If the buyer does waive the contingency, then if this does not close, the buyer does not retain the protections of this. So if the buyer has the option to waive and they proceed with the waived agreement, then the buyer's waiver also waives all the other contingency protections that are helping them in this entire contract. So by waiving, the consequence of waiving means that the entire contract is going to close in 30 days. And if it cannot do that, then the buyer will lose their earnest money. So we're going to look at this in real life situations too. The closing date of your purchase and sale agreement is going to say C22B or to be determined. And this is one of the only acceptable times that you can write in an unknown date, because the 22B says specifically that it will close 3 days later. So how do we give notice? We're talking about all this, if I get this offer, and what do I do if this and that? So putting this in a more real life situation, say you get an offer. You're going to look at the form 90K. This is the form in its entirety. And the 90K notice can actually be given for several reasons. The first one I want to talk about is the first paragraph, where we're going to either satisfy or waive this contingency. If you get an offer as a 22B buyer and everything looks great, then you're going to go ahead and attach the offer to this 90K. And you would check box 1 that says buyer's property is sold and the contingency is satisfied. You've followed all the rules that are required to make sure it's satisfied. You haven't violated any of the closings less than 30 days or more than 45 days, and you have not done anything without seller's consent. You have technically satisfied your contingency. This also means that any other protections you had in the contract are still in place unless those are also waived. The second option is you didn't sell your property, but you're just going to waive this contingency anyway. So this might be a situation where you are reaching just the end of this timeline and you have got to have this house. Maybe there's another way to make this happen besides using the home sale contingency. Well, if you want to go ahead and just take your chances on this, or maybe the buyer has a backup plan, this is another option for the buyer to waive the contingency and go ahead and move to closing. Now, keep in mind, when you are waiving the contingency, you're waiving all of the contingencies. So you could have a solid buyer that's cash and doesn't really mind, but if this is an option you're checking for your clients, please make sure you're letting them know that no contingency protections will be following them for this transaction. Then we have the option of, going through this entire I'm going to call it 45-day contract, and it just didn't happen. If the buyer has their home listed and they just can't get it to close, or they can't get it under contract, then they would check this middle box right here that says they've failed to get their house to get under contract, and they would be terminating this purchase and sale agreement. This would award the earnest money back to the buyer because they've given their good faith to make it happen. They've tried the entire time the contingency was available, and it just didn't work out. The first box, failure to close and reinstatement, would be a situation where maybe the buyer was under contract and their buyer backed out after a week. Now, they still had time left on their contingency where they still had to show that they were attempting to sell this property in order to close that sale. So they would check the box number 1, putting it back on the market and trying again. And the third option for this would be, hey, it didn't close, but I'm giving you notice that it's failed to close. I still want to make this happen. So this would be the situation where the buyer would waive the contingency again as the other, and just remove the protection of all the other contingencies in this to make this happen. If you're a seller and you notice that an unapproved sale has gone through without the consent, this would be less than 30 days, more than 45 days, or if your 22B buyer accepted a contingent offer without permission. If the seller chooses to terminate, this is the same form you would use to give that notice of termination. So if an offer has been accepted that requires the seller consent without actually getting the consent, the seller may terminate and take the buyer's earnest money. This action must be done within 3 days of receiving the notice. And if the seller chooses not to terminate, this contract moves forward as if the consent was granted. So all this talk about consent, how do we get consent? There is a form 90L, and don't worry about remembering the names of all these forms. They're actually listed when you use the 22B. So the 90L is the seller's consent. The first thing you want to do with seller's consent is ask that seller. So the buyer sends in the request by signing the top line right here that says buyer request. When they request, they're going to choose one of these options here that they are going to get permission for. So these are going to be all the options I stated before. Either they're going to be potentially accepting another contingent sale, another pending sale. They want to extend closing beyond the 45 days to accept, or they want to accept an offer before 30 days. They would do any of those 4 box options. The 5th option on the bottom is actually for once a contract is in place and everything's moving forward, if there needs to be an adjustment on the closing date for that 22B buyer. Remember, you can't change closing dates because they directly affect that seller. The seller closes 3 days later. So if your first buyer's buyer wants to change the closing date, since it does directly affect that seller, you do need consent, and that would be the 5th box on the bottom. Now, one last-ish thing. When you have a contingent offer, keep in mind anytime it has not been marked from contingent to pending, or anytime that contingency has not been waived, that buyer is risking potentially getting bumped by another offer. So you may see a bump notice, which is form 44. And this would be maybe another offer came in that the seller wants to accept, and the buyer's contingency has not yet been waived or satisfied. It's just a really simple single notice that tells that buyer that the seller has accepted a second offer that could potentially bump them out of the way if they're not willing to waive or satisfy their contingency. This also has listed how a buyer responds. So again, don't worry about remembering any of these form numbers. The buyer simply responds with the form 46 at one of the 3 options that we already have seen before in other parts of the sale. They can respond by saying, my property is sold. I'm going to attach a copy of the purchase and sale agreement. They're going to waive all their contingencies and move forward, or they're going to go ahead and terminate and get their earnest money back. Just remember that whenever you send these notices, you must attach a complete copy of the mutual contract to those notices. So bumping another buyer, make sure if you are a seller accepting a second buyer that you use the second buyer addendum so you don't inadvertently end up accepting 2 offers at the same time. I just wanted to pull up second buyer's addendum, and I won't go over it in too much detail, but it needs to be attached if there is a buyer in position number 2. And when you fill this out, you're going to reference the buyer in position number 1 with the buyer's closing date. And then you do have the option for the second buyer to waive any number of these contingencies listed in paragraph 2 before they're eligible to bump the first buyer out of the place. If you're in a position where your first buyer has gone through most of their contingencies, like maybe they have a title contingency, an HOA review, and a home inspection, you may want to also consider not bumping that buyer completely out until your backup buyer, or the one you're using as the bump, also has just as strong of those contingencies waived. This also just makes reference of which forms you want to use when you reply to how this bump is received. You're going to, at some point, if you have a second buyer, need to either notify them that they've been put into first position or notify them that the first buyer has actually waived or satisfied their contingency and they are no longer needing to be a second buyer. And then giving notice to second buyer is also referenced when you use Form 39. It's just a notice for the 39N, which lets the seller communicate to that second buyer and put them either in, like I said, put them in the first position then, or let them know that that first buyer was able to satisfy or waive. So there's a lot going on here. I wanted to just summarize it up and, bullet point some of the things that we should be remembering when we use contingent sale forms. Remember that we don't want to disclose the funds that are needed from the home sale on another form. So we wouldn't use a 22EF to disclose that we have this home sale if we have a 22B in place. The 22B is its own contingency. So if you want to add extra protections for the buyer, you need to add those contingencies in as well. The 22B only takes care of the sale of the home. The consent is needed for any change in the closing date after a mutual acceptance. Consent is needed for an extension an extended or a shortened closing date. Consent is needed for a 22B buyer to accept another 22B or 22Q offer. Try not to put your clients in a situation where their contingencies or their earnest money is going to be risked. A buyer cannot terminate before the contingency time is over based on the 22B unless the buyer has another contingency out. They can't just get tired of trying to sell their house and let it go and try to get out before the timeline that they've promised to keep trying. A seller has complete freedom to continue marketing this home until the contingency is either waived or satisfied. This means that seller can do whatever it takes to get their home sold. They can have open houses, they can allow showings, and they can even lower the list price. As a listing agent, your job is to get the seller the best price for the best terms. Thank you for paying attention, and I am here to answer any questions or talk about scenarios that maybe you've gone through in contingent offers.